Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with the next update for my project 100 pans. If you've been following my channel this year, you know that I'm trying to pan on 100 eyeshadows this year, which is quite a lofty goal. But I'm going to talk about where I've been in last quarter and just kind of where I am halfway through the year with my pans and if I'm kind of on track or if I'm behind. But before I jump into any of the pans, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. But let's just jump into the first eyeshadow pan that I hit in April. So just to give some background as well, before in the first quarter I hit 26 pans, which is pretty good for me. And yeah, so the first pan that I hit was number 27 for the year, and that came from my Novena palette, and the shade that I hit pan on was the shade Dreamer right here. So that is this kind of highlighting shade in the corner, and it took me 10 uses in my A to C product pan to hit pan on this eyeshadow. When I tell you the usage, it's only usage from certain projects. So I have a few shades I think that I don't have any usage on because I use them outside of projects and I don't really track my usage then. And also I haven't really tracked any prior usage on the eyeshadows before putting it into projects. So just to give you a better idea of like the numbers, but yeah, I have 10 uses of Dreamer in my A to C product pan and I hit pan on this eyeshadow. So pan number 28 came from my Naked Basics palette, which is my Panda palette this year. And the shade that I hit pan on as number 28 is the shade Faint right there. It's like a deep kind of taupey brown shade. And yeah, this took me 35 uses to hit pan on in my Panda palette project. So for the next eyeshadow, which is number 29, we have a shade from my Beauty Bay and Nikki Tutorials palette, and the shade that I was working on is the shade Vla, which is this kind of, I would say almost pastel-y pink, but it's also quite bright shade right there. I'm not sure you can pick up the pan, it's quite a small pan. But yeah, I pan on this after 8 uses in my A to C project pan. So the 30th pan that I hit this year came from my Naked 3 palette, and this came from my Pandos eyeshadows product, and I do have my regular Naked palette and my Naked 3 that I rotate through and try to hit pan on. And the shade that I hit pan on as number 30 is my shade Limit, which is this matte shade right here. I had this, like I said, in my Pandos eyeshadows, and it took me 24 times to hit pan on this shade. For 31, we come back to my Novena palette. Again, I had a shade in my A to C project pan, and the one that I hit pan on for number 31 is the shade Wild Child, which is this pink shade right there. And this shade took me 10 uses to hit pan on, and yeah, that was the second pan that I hit in this palette. So number 32 is one of my MAC singles, and this is one of the Extra Dimension eyeshadows in the shade Amorous Alloy. This was again in my Pandos eyeshadows, and you can see the tiny pan right there, and this one took me 5 uses to hit pan on. Then for number 33, we are going rapidly back to my Novena palette, and we have the third pan that I hit in this palette this year, and that is the shade Love right here, and this took me 13 times to hit pan on through my A to C project pan. So the last pan that I hit in April comes from my Anastasia Preston palette, and the shade that I hit pan on then was the shade Eternal, which is this one right here. I had this in my Deck of Panning project pan, and it took me 8 uses in the project to hit pan on this eyeshadow. And yeah, like I said, that was the last eyeshadow that I hit in the month of April. So in that first quarter of the year, I hit 8 new pans, which is pretty good. I think I need to hit like 8 pans to be on average each month to reach my goal, if I remember correctly, or something like that. So 8 pans in April is pretty good. So let's move on to what I hit in May. So the first shade that I hit pan on in May is actually one of my Super Shock shadows, and this was in my Partisan Cream project pan. And this is the 35th pan that I hit this year, and it comes from the Super Shock shadow in the shade Millionaire. As you can see right there, that is the pan, and this took me 14 times to hit pan on. Number 36 comes from my Mint to Be palette, and I hit pan on the shade Mojito Mummy in here. As you can see, it is the only pan that I have in this palette. But yeah, this one took me 15 uses to hit pan on, and it was in my whole collection project pan. I really enjoyed the shade. It was a perfect shade to work on in spring, but I have grown quite tired of my mint looks, but I did hit pan on this in May. So sticking to the greens, but going on the other kind of end of greens, I have a shade from my Try palette, and I was working on this in my Deck of Panning project pan, and I have the shade Tootsie, which is this really kind of warm toned yellowy green up here. It was a beautiful shade. I really enjoyed working on this, and this one took me 10 times to pan on, and yeah, I really enjoy this, but it is a very out there shade as well. So pan number 38 came from my Panda palette again, and the shade I hit pan on this time was the shade Crave, which is the black shade in the palette, which is right here. This one took me 28 uses in my Panda palette project to pan on, so that is pan number 38. Next up we have a shade that originally came from my Yes Please palette by Colourpop, and this is a shade that I had in my Pando's eyeshadows, but I have since departed that palette, so I do have it as a single now. This one took me 24 uses to pan on, and it was a decent sized pan, which I'm really happy about. I really enjoy this shade, and it is the type of shade that I use quite regularly, so it wasn't too difficult to pan on, although it took quite a few uses. So the last pan that I hit in May comes from my Subculture palette, and the shade that I hit pan on in here is the shade Dawn. It is my first pan in this palette. I was working on this eyeshadow through my Pando's eyeshadows project, and it took me 14 times to hit pan on that eyeshadow. So in the month of May I actually only hit 6 pans, which, I mean, it's still a really good month if you think about it in like the grand scheme of things, but for this project it was definitely a bit kind of a not great month for me. But yeah, 6 pans in the month of May. So let's move on to the pans that I hit in the month of June. The first pan that I hit in the month of June is a bit more of a complicated one to explain, because I had this in my Colourpop She palette in this place of Philly, but it originally is actually a shade from the Element of Surprise palette in the shade Rayon. I actually merged those two palettes together, which is why I ended up in my She palette, and since then I have also departed that palette, so I do have it as a single now. But like I said, I did hit pan on this eyeshadow, and it took me 9 uses to hit that pan. Pan number 42 this year came from my Anastasia Amrezy palette. This one, which I was working on this past month, was the shade Anastasia right here, which I was working on in my A to C project pan. And this one took me 9 uses to pan on as well. It was a beautiful shade and I really enjoyed this, but I am happy to now have actually 4 pans in this palette, which I'm really surprised about, because it's one of my newer Anastasia palettes. So next up we actually have a shade that I don't have any uses on, because I did hit pan on this outside of any project, and that is again a shade from my Nikkie Tutorials and Beauty Bay palette. And the shade that I decided to work on my own time is this shade right here, which is called Ivy. It's just this kind of light silvery kind of shimmery shade, and I used it mainly as an inner corner highlight. But like I said, I didn't track any usage on it because I was working on it on my own time. And the reason why I kind of started working on this was because I wasn't really working on any corner shades in any of projects apart from the one in my Panda palette. But I'm not too worried about that, so I just wanted to kind of focus on some other inner corner highlight shades to try to hit pan on, and I did hit pan on Ivy. For pan number 44 we have a shade from my Soft Glam palette, and I did hit pan on the shade Mulberry, which is this one here. I did mention it in my A to C project pan, which is where this pan comes from, that I actually hit like 2 baby pans next to each other, and I found that to be the most hilarious thing because that never happened to me before, but you can definitely see it right there. Again, I'm sure that will go away when I use it for another time, but this one is also a shade that I probably worked on for the longest out of all of my shades. It took me 38 uses to pan on, so a really long time, so I was ready to put this away once I pan on it, which is why I haven't used it since. But yes, that was pan number 44. For number 45 we have a shade from my Through My Eyes palette. This one is a really well-loved palette for me from Colourpop, and the shade that I was working on in my whole collection project pan was the shade Loma right here, and it took me 11 uses to hit that pan. For number 46 we have a shade from my Star Wars, the Child palette by Colourpop. I was working on the shade Babyface right here, which is a center shade. It took me quite a long time to pan on this, but I was working on this in my Pando's eyeshadows. This eyeshadow took me 20 times to pan on, but since it is more of a kind of mint shade, I didn't use it every single day, so that actually took me I think 3 months to pan on in my Pando's eyeshadows. But I really did enjoy it when I did wear it, and I actually have 2 pans in this palette now, which I'm really excited about because it is a really new palette in my collection. For number 47 we have a pan from my Modern Renaissance palette by Anastasia, and I hit pan on the shade Raw Sienna down here. This one took me 22 uses to pan on, and as you can see this is another well-used palette in my collection, and I now have 8 pans in this palette, and I'm hoping to hit more pans maybe this year or definitely next year. And if I didn't mention, I was working on this eyeshadow in my A to C project pan. So number 48 came from my Saharan 2 palette by Juvia's Place, and that is the shade Hadia, which is this one here. I was working on this in my Pan eyeshadows project, which was my last rotation, and I did hit pan on this eyeshadow after 11 uses, and I'm really happy about that because this palette was one that was very kind of unused in my collection, but I have reached for it a lot since rolling it in that project. So that's just one thing that I love about panning, because that means that you get to discover kind of eyeshadows to work on and just fall in love with products again. So yeah, I was really excited to pan on this eyeshadow, and I'm definitely planning to hopefully pan on more shades in this palette throughout the year. So we've actually come to the final eyeshadow pan that I hit this year, and that came from my Club Nebula palette by Kaleidos in collaboration with Angelica Nyqvist. I was working on this shade again in my Panos eyeshadows, and if you watch my last update, you know that I pan on this, but that is the shade down here, which is the shade Nebula, and it took me 8 times to pan on that shade. So with that, I actually hit 9 pans in the month of June, which is really good, and I was glad to hit a few more pans in June since I didn't do too great in May. But so far this year, in the first 2 quarters of the year and the first half of the year, I have hit 49 pans, which I am really happy about. I mean, technically I think if you look at it half-half, I should have hit 50 pans, and I did actually calculate out how many pans I should have hit at the end of June, and I should have hit 49.59 pans, so I'm technically like half a pan behind, but I'm not too worried about that because I'm hoping that I can kind of focus in on some shades and hit more pans in the next coming months. And it's not like I'm super far behind, I'm just like 1 shade possibly behind hitting pan on, so I think I'm basically on track, and I'm so excited because 49 pans hit in 6 months is amazing to me, because in 2020 I think I hit like maybe was 53 pans in total, so I'm basically almost panning at twice the speed this year, which I'm very excited about. So yeah, that is basically where I am with my project 100 pans, and I really hope you enjoyed this kind of video with some pan showing and just kind of admiring everything that I had pan on this year. But yeah, that is it for today. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and also let me know how many pans you hit this year if you are tracking pans, and otherwise I will catch you in my next video. Bye guys!